it's been a couple of weeks since I've seen the film, and it's still very fresh on my mind. First of all, congratulations on it. I think it cements your legacy as our generation's one of them, certainly greatest documentary filmmakers. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And it's obviously relevant to topics we frequently cover here. So I want to talk to you about a lot of the substance that involves, I think, for me, the topics at least are U.S. foreign policy and investigative journalism. But before I get to that, I just want to ask you one question about the process of the filmmaking, because when I went in to watch this film, the one doubt I had was, Cy Hersh is a huge inspiration for me as an investigative journalist. I think he is probably for anybody who considers themselves that. His stories are so, historic that you feel like you're very familiar with them. And I read his book. So part of me was thinking, is there going to be anything new here? And yet I found the film so affecting, like on almost every level, obviously emotionally and psychologically, having to watch a lot of that, but even the thought-provoking process of reconsidering and thinking about how these events not were just allowed to happen, but continue to happen. And I know you're not a big fan of talking about yourself, but I do wonder, you spent years working on this film. The footage we saw in the film, I'm sure, is a tiny fraction of what you and your colleagues spent years immersed in. And some of it is, very difficult to watch. Even Cy said that a lot of times in these stories, he kind of had to stop, like he couldn't take it, just in terms of the atrocity and the savagery and barbarism. What did you personally take away from the film? Like, how did it alter your perspective or view of these kinds of issues that you have yourself spent a big part of your career working on?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's great to be here and to talk to you about the film. And I thought you'd appreciate, Sai's sort of doggedness and sort of how he sort of, doesn't always make friends when he's doing his reporting. And there are some echoes for those of your audience who know that we made a film together, also about journalism, also about state wrongdoing and lies and cover-ups. Yeah, so I mean, I was really interested. I mean, I approached Cy first, and when I was in the middle of the Iraq War reporting, like I'd gone to Iraq right after the Abu Ghraib torture photographs were public, came back and reached out to Cy, and he was very generous. I really wanted to make a film about him then, but I never like that idea never left me, and the reason is because his body of work is just so extraordinary, and so with the film, what I really wanted to do is okay, let's looking at a long historical scale and look at this repetition. Like, how does the government, commit these atrocities, lie about them, try to cover them up, try to pressure the press not to publish them, right? Because that's a big part of the story, right? The government's always asking the press not to publish about these atrocities, and then cyber, reporting them, and then they're ultimately being impunity, right? There's ultimately nobody higher up is held accountable. I mean, that's what we see over and over and over again. So that sort of became the story, right? Because I knew, some of, the My Lai reporting was known, and to Abu Ghraib as well. But I was interested in what are the thematic through lines if you look at history, stepping back, and we were really inspired by films that I think you also love, like All the President's Men, The Parallax View, these sort of 70s paranoia thrillers, and how to create that sense of that there's something that the government is always hiding and lying about, and create that sort of a vibe in the film and to tell that story. But we were also very much trying to stay in the edit room. So I was editing, and Amy Foote and Peter Bowman. And the rule in the edit room, there were a couple different rules. One was don't get ahead of the story, so that we know the audience knows what Cy knows in the moment. So with My Lai, first it's just there's going to be a court martial, and then he meets a lawyer, and then the lawyer leads to a name, and etc. So we kind of play it out, both to sort of create a sense of this is how it works. You don't know everything all at once, right? You have a gut instinct, you follow your instinct, and you follow the story. And we wanted the film to have that, so that a film like All the President's Men, I can still rewatch it even though I know the story, right? Because it's good filmmaking. And so how do we make the filmmaking have this kind of a dramatic pulse? And yeah, I don't know. And I just keep returning to these themes. Partly because this country keeps repeating similar, I think, catastrophic errors, for instance, regime change in other countries, which has never turned out very well. And yet the press just seems to sit down and dutifully copy the government's narrative, rather than say let's look at how this has failed us in the past. And so, yeah, it's very much about the present for me, and as well as history.
Yeah, so I guess that's my question. I watch a film like the one that you just produced with your colleagues and walk away very affected. And I'm sure most decent people would. And exactly as you said, we're not all, but most of us know the story of My Lai and Abu Ghraib and just the general atrocities of wars in general and U.S. wars in particular. And yet, even though people are well familiar now with the fact that the government lied us into the Vietnam War, with the Gulf Tonkin, into with the Iraq War, obviously with WMD, et cetera, you just watch how easy it is to not just sell new wars, even when Americans say they're sick of these words, they don't want regime change, but using exactly the same scripts. Just out of nowhere, Nicolas Maduro is a narco terrorist and is going to pass all kinds of resources to Hezbollah, which is going to come to the same with Iran, obviously, and regime change there.
Yeah. And students are dangerous terrorists. Students who protest wars or they're communists. The similar. We have to spy on them. Yeah, it's the same script over and over.
Right.
In a way,
so I'm just wondering for you and for your expectations of the film. I know I've had to combat and still have to combat this sense of futility sometimes. Like you think, okay, this is super eye-opening. People realize the government has repeatedly lied to them. And then you watch and you see that war propaganda is as effective as ever, even though it's barely unchanged from what was previously debunked. So in terms of your process of making the film and what your expectations were, how did you kind of confront that in your mind as a filmmaker?
I mean, one would hope, and I don't think that's. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to live through this moment, having just made this film, right? Where you think don't fall for the lie again, right? Or the press should not follow, dutifully repeat the government's narrative. Don't do this again. It's catastrophic. We've seen it. There's absolute consensus that Vietnam was a catastrophe. So was Iraq. So was, over and over. And yet we sort of go, oh wow, the CIA kidnapped someone. Let's do a beat by beat of how they did it, as if we don't know that the CIA is capable of murdering anyone on the planet, right? This is not, that's not the news. And so I don't know, I guess I would wish that maybe, that the public is more skeptical and that journalists were more adversarial, right? I mean, that's what I would hope, that those two things could happen. Because I do think we in the United States, there is, a free press still, right? And so this idea that you would self-censor or not, question the government's narrative is so shameful, right? Because we have the right to do it, right? It's protected. And yet we still, we see the press over and over not being adversarial, being too close to power. And then here we go again, because I do think the press is important in raising these questions for the public. And also, and I think, this is something you've talked about and written about a lot, is that there's a lot of distrust of the press by the public because of the press lying to the public or the press censoring information from the public, right? So I think all of that needs to be, reestablished. I mean, facts are facts. They're not partisan and they should be published. And we need journalists that are going to, make some people unhappy that are in power.
Yeah, on that point, George Orwell, in this preface that was supposed to be part of what was Animal Farm, but ironically, he had a lot of trouble publishing it. That's one of the main points he made that I think has kind of eluded us in our understanding, is that so often the most effective forms of censorship or propaganda aren't, when you have thugs in black uniforms marching on the street and dragging away dissidents to prison because it's so overt that everyone understands it. It's more the climate of social rewards and incentive and exclusion that creates the kind of self-censorship that, for example, in Great Britain, he was saying is even more repressive in a lot of ways than what we think of as the more repressive countries. And that is the irony, is that on the one hand, you do still have freedom of the press and perfectly protected, et cetera. And on the other hand, you have this corporate media that just seems so instinctively eager, especially in the times most important, to be even more subservient to state messages than ever. So I want to ask you about that, because to me, the film is obviously about the Vietnam War and the Iraq War and U.S. aggression and foreign policy and all that. But it's certainly, it's the main subject is Seymour Hersh and therefore investigative journalism. And to me, and this is one of the things that your film really, I think, finalized, is that I would say pretty much clearly, without a lot of doubt, Seymour Hersh is, the greatest and most accomplished investigative journalist of that generation. And interestingly, we're both critics of the corporate media, but we, I think, both recognize that there are people inside corporate media who try and do good work.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and of course, he himself, spent years working at the New York Times, the New Yorker. He's always kind of had one foot in, one foot out. What is it about him, having spent all this time talking to him, studying his work? What are the attributes that you think made him stand out as such a great investigative journalist in comparison to his peers?
Right. I mean, I think a number of things, and in the film, it's a portrait. It's a portrait of like this country, a history of this country through the lens of size reporting. And we go into his background. We go into the fact that he grew up. His parents are immigrants from Eastern Europe. They came over in the 1920s during the pogroms, so it was before the Holocaust. But the entire extended communities, were killed in the Holocaust. And in the family, there was just a lot of silence. And he grew up in Chicago, poor. His dad had a dry cleaning store in the South Side. And so he saw injustice, he saw racial inequality, he saw how, certain people got ahead, and it wasn't because they were, smarter, because there were sort of systemic inequalities. And he was in his bones. And I think it's also in his bones to like be distrustful of power and silence, right? He's always trying to get to an answer. And, I think so he has all those skills. He's got, great curiosity, people skills. I mean, I saw that at play making the film. I mean, we had a big team of people, and he was just so engaged with everyone. He wasn't somebody who just like knew my name and then there was a sound person. Like he knows Brian, he knows, everybody by name. Everyone's been to his house, he's cooked for them, so he has like a real way with people, and wants, like if you met him, he would know about, where you went to school. He'd know about your debating club, where did you learn to, what you did. So he just has that kind of like, everybody got interrogated by Sy in the process of making the film. But I think the thing that I really admire and love about his career trajectory is that once he sort of really made his name, really as an outsider, right? With My Lai, like publishing a story that nobody wanted, it was rejected by everyone, and then became the biggest story in the world, changed the war, gets a job at the Times, and, looks around and just like, what is going on here? That's sort of, subservience to power, subservience to government narratives. And he never kind of fell for like, oh, this, like I'm comfortable in this job at the Times or the New Yorker or anything. He just was always difficult towards the government mostly, but I think also in work situations. I don't think he was easy to edit. I think he's, I agree with you. He's done, I think, in the greatest body of work. And I think other journalists in his position maybe get comfortable, right? And then there's this seduction of, access, right? To power. And that's, I think, we know some journalists that have fallen for that. So, and he just never did. He has no interest in being invited to a cocktail party. Even this, releasing the film is like, do I have to go to another cocktail? Like there's something about the release and, festivals, and he just wants to, he wants to write, and he's still writing today, and he's obsessed. I mean, he's obsessed about Gaza, and he's obsessed that this is happening as the world is watching. Like we have this genocide unfolding on camera, and yet we haven't stopped it. And I think that just, drives him, like morally, I think he finds it so offensive. But
that's what interests me so much, Laura. I want to like maybe it is a little elusive because maybe it's like a more psychological question than anything else. But
yeah,
if you look at Sy's just record in terms of accolades, you cannot find anybody with more impressive accolades. Just the number of awards that he's won at the highest level of journalism, and yet he's ending his life and ending his career essentially unemployable in mainstream media. I mean, since he left the New York Times, he's went to Substack. If you listen to how, extremely unaccomplished journalists speak of him, it's like he's some kind of a nutcase, sort of like the way he began. And that's not because he was forced into that. I mean, along the way, he could easily have taken the much, more lucrative and tension-free path, have been celebrated as this, sort of the Bob Woodward path. And yet he took the opposite path. And I remember when I first got to NYU Law School, which is kind of known, where it brands itself as this very like public interest left-wing kind of law school. Like you go and you learn how to represent the indigent and the poor. Everybody who gets there, they do a survey in the first year. Where do you want to go work? And everybody says, oh, I want to go work at like public interest firms. And maybe like 4% people say, I want to go work at big Wall Street law firms. And by the third year, they do the same questionnaire and everybody says, 95%, oh, I'm going to work at big law firms. Like even people who enter these institutions, law school or corporate media, who might have the same kind of intentions that Cy has. Like, I want to fight against the establishment. I want to, do the kind of reporting that confronts power, succumb to all of those human incentives that you just laid out, like wealth and access. And we had the same thing during Snowden, where we saw the kind of doors that can open up. I once had breakfast with Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he talked about how he was always fighting against walking through those doors and has kind of removed himself from the public platform in a lot of ways to avoid that. Cy Hersh, to me, is like the ultimate example of that. And to me, it seems like that's a big factor in why he succeeded so much as a journalist. How do you connect those kind of personality traits with the work?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite stories that just had to be in the movie is when he and Jeff Girth, he brings Jeff, who's also this sort of like writing for this underground, about sort of corporate power and money, and it's like, we're going to investigate a corporation. At that point, which is kind of shocking. I mean, we fact checked this. The Times had never investigated a corporation. They decided to investigate Gulf and Western, and at some point, Jeff says, I think I should look into the corporate filings of the New York Times. And then they found out that the executive editor, Abe Rosenthal, had gotten a loan from the board, and it was like a sweet deal, like very low interest. And you have Cy like run, basically like going into his boss's office, say, what the fuck is this? Like, how do you expect us to do our job? We can't publish what we know because you've taken this loan. And ultimately Abe Rosenthal did remortgage his apartment because of what Cy did. But it's just, I think he's just not like he would talk about that he was supposed to be in love with the Times, and he just wasn't in love with the New York Times. Like he's in love with journalism and investigative journalism. He's in love with getting the story. He's in love with writing. He's not in love with an institution or the sort of the doors that are open. And in terms of being at Substack, he says, I've always been a bit of an outsider, so it's perfect, and he's not, there are a lot of people who are going there for different reasons, as you went there before you started the show. So I think it's, I think it says something about journalism, the state of journalism, where we're at with it. But in terms of what makes him tick, one thing about Cy is that he could always tell you what he did, but when you asked him, why did you do it? He's not good at answering that question. He's just not. We asked it a million times. He ultimately, in the end, he says, what else can you do? I think for him, it's like, if he's not chasing the story, he's not feeling, that he's alive,
Yeah, I think Cy might be the only person on earth who dislikes talking about themselves more than you do.
Yeah.
And that was such an interesting tension in the film. I do want to say, like, one thing that really struck me that I think surprised me, because I've known Cy for a while, not great or anything. I don't think we've ever even met in person, but we've had interactions, and he obviously has a reputation for being a very cantankerous sort, and I think the film shows that that's not just a reputation, but at least to some extent, certainly a big part of how he interacts with almost everybody. At the same time, what struck me so much, Laura, was when he talked about what I alluded to earlier, which is the fact that doing all of this reporting on these atrocities, on this barbarism, on this savagery of our own government, of having to just constantly, face and delve into and investigate and talk about just the worst. Like he talks so openly about how difficult that was for him emotionally. And so to me, most professional journalists, I think they think almost like it's noble, or maybe it just happens automatically, or maybe they didn't have a very strong moral conscience to begin with. They kind of look at it as like a profession. Like you write about these things in the abstract, but you don't really write about them in these strongly moral terms, and therefore don't connect to them in that way. After all these years, he still does. He's so affected when he talks about these massacres and torture and the like. How important do you think that is in terms of why he's been so intrepid in this work?
Yeah, totally. I mean, he's been. I think would say he's still obsessed with the My Lai, like what happened there and how could it happen, and what's really interesting about how he broke it. So the event happened in the spring of '68, and he didn't report it until over a year later. So, and he got a tip and followed it, and at that point, like a lot of people knew about it. Ron Rittenhour had written letters to Congress as a whistleblower. He breaks the story. It's a huge story, but he does these, and they syndicate it. Like this is, it's this amazing thing. He and David Opes, they write the story and then they call the Boston Globe and they say, we can, you can publish this for $100, and that's how they do it. They syndicate it. So he sort of starts with this model, but then at some point there's no question that the massacre happened, right? The photographs then come out in Life magazine. But Sy doesn't stop there. He after he does the first stories, he continues and speaks to 50 more soldiers to understand not that it happened, but how could it happen? And because he could not understand it, like he couldn't understand how these kids, and he'd been in the army. How do these kids? What happened? What are the conditions? And what was the chain of command that, that created those conditions? So he's obsessed with it and obsessed with whether or not the right people were ever held accountable. I mean, the fact that, General Westmoreland, who ran this war, who ordered these for these body counts, like that this was the metric, this is what allowed these soldiers to go in and slaughter this village of civilians, including babies. They wanted body counts. And they actually, this is dark. After the massacre, that actually the New York Times published, there was a press release from the army saying we had this big victory against the North Vietnamese, and it was the My Lai massacre, and it was published. So it was like they put out this propaganda, and it got replicated. And then Sy ultimately, explained what really happened. And I think I think the fact that nobody in a position of power was held accountable still, haunts him. And the stories, to what he heard, and also to kind of, what these soldiers went, what I think he absorbed the trauma of that, what happened on that day. And so, yeah, and I think he does carry it with him, like emotionally to today. It's not like something from the past.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.